Okay, we have 52 people here today, so I think that's enough to get started. I want to welcome everyone to the first Team Research Forum of 2023. I hope everyone had a wonderful end of year break. To start the year, we have a group of colleagues from the UC Davis Library and from the School of Medicine CTSC to talk a little bit about the OSTP Open Access Memo that some of you are probably familiar with. But most of our session will be focused on the new NIH data sharing and management policy. So to cover these topics, we have three colleagues from the UC Davis Library. Michael Ladish is the Scholarly Communications Officer and the program lead at the UC Davis Library. He provides guidance and support to UC Davis researchers community on issues related to publishing with focus on open access, as well as copyright for teaching and research. And
they started promptly.
And we also have Megan Van Noord. She's the health sciences librarian. She works with the UC Davis research community through research consultation and collaboration to connect biomedical knowledge networks to each stage of research lifestyle. We're also welcoming this morning Beth Tweedy. Beth supports researchers at UC Davis through the research process with personalized consultations across a broad range of research and data topics. She's the STEM librarian for life sciences. And from the School of Medicine, CTSC, we're welcoming Christy Navarro. She's the CTSC Health Informatics Research Data Officer, and she works with researchers and collaborates across UC Davis and UC Davis health departments to help accelerate research with health equity data resources. So what we're going to do today is our colleagues here have a couple of presentations to share with you. I encourage everyone to start posting your questions to the chat box so we can start looking at what's coming up. And then when we're done with the presentations, we're going to open it up for Q&A, and we're going to keep it open until noon or until we run out of questions, whatever happens first. All the materials that we are presenting today are going to be shared with you via email, and we will have a recording posted online for those of you who want to revisit it or for colleagues who might not have been able to join us today. So with that, I'm going to let our panelists take over and start their presentations.
Okay, so I think it's my turn to start. So thank you, Ana Lucia, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and I'm happy to be here in this venue to talk about the OSTP Open Access Memo. That's the first part, and it will take about 15 minutes, if at all, before I hand it over to my colleagues, Beth and Megan, who will talk about the NIH Open Access Data Policy. So Beth, could you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So in August last year, it's already last year now, so I have to get used to this term when I refer to 2020. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is a branch of the White House of the federal government, released a memorandum for the heads of executive departments and agencies to ensure free, immediate, equitable access to federal funded research. This memorandum is, in short, it's named the OSTP Memo, or also sometimes referred to as the Nelson Memo, because Nelson is the director of the OSTP. This memo created quite a bit of headlines in the academic community, but even beyond. So New York Times reported on it and so on. So next slide, please. And this memo is, if you can call it an extension or an update or whatever. It's built on a previous memorandum that was released in 2013 to facilitate easy public search, analysis of, and access to peer-reviewed scholarly publication. This memo was, or this directive was relevant and applied only to federal agencies that have more than 1 million annual research expenditures. So there was the National Institute of Health, it was the National Science Foundation, I think Department of Energy was in there as well, but it didn't apply to all of it. It was also a directive that allowed publishers to put a 12 months post-publication embargo period on the publications. So if you work with NIH grants in some way, then you know that the publications are being submitted and uploaded to PubMed Central, which is the repository for NIH-funded material, that there was the 12 months embargo. So the material was not available right away. Next slide, please. The new memo, the 2022 one, has some changes, significant changes to the compared to the older memo, 2013, and one is no more embargoes. So the material, the publications should be made available and publicly accessible by default in an agency designated repository without any embargo or delay after publication. So that is quite a change. That is also quite important, especially in disciplines where research is developing very fast. So this is like the newspaper from yesterday. So sometimes a publication that's a year old is not that relevant anymore because research is such a fast pace. So this is wonderful news. A lot of people are very happy about this. Publishers probably not so much because they have to adjust now somehow their workflow and the process and so on in order to facilitate this. So the second change, or the second new thing that's different in the OSTP memo from last year is that all agencies are covered. So in 2013, it was only agencies, federal agencies that have more than 100 million research development expenditures. Now it's all federal agencies. So it includes smaller ones like the National Endowments for Humanities, National Endowments for the Arts, the Institute of Museum and Library Studies, that's ours. So whenever you get federal funding, you will be confronted at some point with the open access requirement. Next slide, please. And the third change and the third new feature in the OSTP memo is that not only peer-reviewed publications are required to be publicly accessible and available, but also the underlying scientific data. So the peer-reviewed publications, that was peer-reviewed scholarly articles in scholarly journals. Now I think it's slightly expanded to peer-reviewed book chapters, to editorials, to peer-reviewed conference proceedings. It is not extended to monographs, to books. So books will not have this requirement to be open access. There are options to publish open access, but that's a different matter. So don't worry if you write a book, you don't have to worry about this in a moment. But in addition to peer-reviewed publications, also the underlying scientific data need to be made available and publicly available at the point of publication. So this, of course, excludes data that are covered by other policies and laws and so on, like privacy issues, confidential data, and so on. But in general, as a rule of thumb, you have to publish this data, make them available as well. So where do you do this? The agencies are asked to develop their own repositories, designated repositories, so something like PubMed Central will pop up for every agencies. I don't know if some of them might work together and create one that works for a number of agencies. We don't know this yet. So all this, the whole text, all the content of the memo is something that is not in effect immediately. So if we go to the next slide, please. You can see here the timeline. The memo was issued in August 2022, and then there are different deadlines for the agencies to develop a plan, how they want to implement it, and also, of course, to give them time to implement it. And in December, end of December 2025, all agencies should have these guidelines active and have a plan for public access to publication that result out of their funding, should have this available. So it's something that is in the process. It's nothing that you have to put on your priority list next week, but you might be well advised to keep an eye on that. And start to think about how you want to, as an author or administrator working with grants, how you want to facilitate that. So it will come for all the federal agencies. We have about, I think, around 50% of our research grants are federal grants, so it's a significant chunk, plus other federal or other funding agencies like the Gates Foundation and so on also have open access requirements. So it will be implemented at the end of 2025, and now we go to the next slide. And the question that I get, of course, quite often then is, so do I have to pay for that? And how do I pay for that? So the memo says that you can deposit your publication then in designated repository, which is free. But in the repositories, they usually deposit only the final peer-reviewed manuscript, so it's not the open, not the version of record, the publisher's version. This is what we call a green open access. So these repositories will be made available. You can also start publishing open access in the first place, this usually is called gold open access. This usually costs some money. The agencies are explicitly allowed to or encouraged to allow to have a budget item for publication costs. So if you have a grant, if you apply for a grant, you can you put publication cost as an item in there. And then later on, when you publish the research, you can publish in full open access or in hybrid open access journals by paying an article processing charge. But the University of California and our library helping with that already. And so we have open access agreements on a UC level, where we provide subvention or pay the full APCs for publications under a specific agreement with a publisher. This is something that I will probably talk about more in detail in one of the next sessions here. So next slide. We have agreements currently, and this applies to all UC campuses. We have agreements with a number of publishers, and we get more this year. So if you publish in a journal with one of these publishers, you can get support from UC by via a subvention, or even if you don't have research funding, you can get a full APC paid. Next slide, please. And the library in Davis has its own fund, so this is separate from what you see on the system level is doing. We also provide some funding for publications in full open access journals. So next slide, please. And here's a couple of links. I would highlight the first one that has a collection of all kinds of opinion pieces, comments, and so on to the OSTP memo. So that's it's a good source if you want to read a little bit more. And then, of course, the you see Office of Scholarly Communication and our library have online information available as well that you can access. You can ask me anytime if you have further questions about the memo or the support that we provide in open access publishing. I'm also happy to come to a department meeting or research group meeting or whatever in Zoom and in person. So any way I can provide this information, I will be happy to. And with that, I think I hand over to Megan.
Thanks, Michael. All right, let's see if I can slide. There we go. I think I added something later. All right, so let's segue into the NIH data management and sharing policy, which came out in 2020, or is due to start in January 25th, 2023. And under the new policy, researchers are expected to maximize the appropriate sharing of scientific data, taking into account factors such as legal, ethical, or technical issues that may limit the extent of data sharing and preservation. This goes into effect, as I just mentioned, January 25th, so in 12 days. And it's going to be required for all new and competing continuation applications that are due on or after the 25th. So previously, data management and sharing plans were only required for large grants receiving over $500,000 in direct costs, or grants that generated large scale genomic data. And the plans were basically like a paragraph in length. And so there's new requirements around that. Basically, it's now going to be required for any award that will generate scientific data. So research projects like R01s for research centers, but it will not be required for research and other activities that do not generate scientific data, like training, fellowships, construction grants, and so forth. I took a quick look in Reporter, and I think in fiscal year 2022, there were about 274 R01s. And of those, like 30% were above $500,000, and the other 60% were below $500,000. So the difference would be in this coming up, all 274 of those would require a data management and sharing plan versus the 30% that it was required before. And the plan itself has changed. Oops. And that was the screenshot. So the data that needs to be shared under the policy. So basically, not all data generated during NIH-supported research will constitute as scientific data. The policy does not expect researchers to share laboratory notebooks, preliminary analyses, completed case report forms, drafts of scientific papers, plans for future research, peer reviews, communications with colleagues, or physical objects such as laboratory specimens. But it does expect any data that's sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings to be shared. So it's good to consider two types of sharing within this policy. This was adapted from a figure in a Nature article, diverse types of data sharing. They present a lot more, but these are the two that are most relevant. Public data sharing and controlled access sharing. So in public sharing, researchers make data broadly available without any restrictions on use. And in controlled access data sharing, research place some conditions on access and reuse. So you'll see that there's like a data access committee that would need to approve access to the data that's put into a repository in a controlled access sharing situation versus the public data sharing situation or where the centralized repository, that data is available to anyone who would like to access it. So you can probably already think about pros and cons to each of those. So for compliance with the NIH data management and sharing policy, and you're going to also see DMS plan. So I just want to make clear that we're talking about the policy, and then we'll talk about planning in a little bit. It's basically three aspects. Prospectively plan for the managing and sharing of scientific data, submit a data management and sharing plan, and then actually follow the approved plan. So that is one thing, is if an award is given, the compliance with the approved plan is required. So what happens if someone doesn't comply? So you can go ahead and read the text above, but compliance with the approved data management and sharing plan, it's going to become a special term and condition in the notice of award and will be monitored throughout the duration of the award. And if award recipients are not compliant with plans at the end of the award, non-compliance may be factored into future funding decisions. So this is kind of like the planning to plan aspect, considering what types of data the research project will generate. Will the research involve human subjects or endangered threatened species? How will personal health information be de-identified? Will access to any of that data need to be controlled? How will informed consent be provided if human subjects are involved? It's important to identify a repository prior to drafting the plan. So there are a lot of examples out there you can provide about how to select repositories. But basically, it's important to go through and kind of check which one's the most appropriate, and then look at their submission requirements. So for the data management and sharing plan itself, pretty brief. It's 2 pages or less. They don't want you to include any hyperlinks, and it includes 6 elements. And I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. So element 1 is data type, and this is a summary of the types of data and amount of data that's going to be generated and used. You need to discuss how the data from the project will be preserved and shared, and provide a brief listing of the metadata, other relevant data, and any associated documentation that will be made accessible to facilitate interpretation of your scientific data. Element 2, related tools, software, and/or code, indicate whether specialized tools are needed to access or manipulate shared scientific data to support any replication or reuse. And think about specifying how needed tools can be accessed if that's applicable. The third element are the standards. So describe what standards, if any, are going to be applied to the scientific data and associated metadata. And there's a lot of guidance out there. So I'm just kind of talking about this very broadly, and we'll get into them in the nitty-gritty if necessary. So the fourth element, data preservation, access, and associated timelines. So provide timelines for how long the data needs to be preserved and how it's going to be accessed. So this is where you're going to where you've already thought about what the best repository is for the data. This is what you'll list it, and then describe how the scientific data will be findable and identifiable. So will there be like a DOI available? When the scientific data is made available to other users, like you need to describe how long that will be. And there may be like different times without the course of a project when the data is submitted, but by the time of publication, the data needs to be in a repository. So the fifth element talks about access, distribution, and reuse. This gets into that sort of prior planning aspect, especially with regards to human subjects. So thinking about how informed consent for data reuse is going to be acquired, thinking about privacy and confidentiality, whether access to scientific data derived from humans will be controlled. So putting it into one of those controlled access repositories. And then any other considerations that may limit the extent of data sharing. So potential limitations on subsequent data use should be communicated to the individual entities, like the data repository manager. So if it's going into a repository, making sure that it's communicated, you know, how long that needs to be for. And the sixth element is oversight of data management and sharing. So indicating how compliance with the DMS plan will be monitored and managed, the frequency of oversight and by whom. And this is actually oversight by the funded institution, not oversight by the NIH. And the policy doesn't actually say or have any expectations about who will be responsible. This one has actually created quite a bit of confusion. So here are like 3 just examples of what that specifically this element might look like. So, you know, monitoring of compliance with the data management sharing plan will be the responsibility of the project's PI is generally what is required. Sorry, some of the questions are coming in, which are good. We'll get to. All right. So there are a lot of resources available. There's a whole suite of example plans being created. Just be aware that copying and pasting from plans, like this is a unique plan for the research project. And it's expected that a researcher will be able to follow it. So I would, you know, they're really there for guidance. The DMP tool has all sorts of templates, not just for the NIH grants, but for all sorts of federal funding agencies, which is a great place to start. And there's some guidance built within the tool on how to create a plan. And then the library offers consultation and advising regarding data management plans, for preparing research data for sharing, funder requirements, data description, identifying data repositories, as well as some of the citing of data sets. So we're here to help. There's also an upcoming, I guess you would just call it event, UC Data Week in February, and there are like several relevant hands-on classes, managing and sharing data for NIH projects, writing a data management and sharing plan for NIH, data de-identification and practice. So I'd encourage anyone who has time and an interest to participate in some of these presentations. Some additional considerations when writing a data management plan, or just thinking about this more broadly, is you know, UC has its own research data policy, which is important to kind of take a look at. And then beyond the scientific data, there are records. And so it's good to kind of look at some of the administrative records relating to research and their retention and disposition requirements. And Campus Council, they're there to help with those aspects. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Beth to kind of discuss some practical tips on once the data management plan is sort of written, like how can you go from there?
Thank you, Megan. So I wanted to, or kind of my section here is we kind of talked about the policy in kind of just broad strokes, but I kind of have a little bit of a different perspective in that I was actually a researcher. I did a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology before becoming a librarian. So I wanted to try and go through some of these elements that we went through and talk about what those might look like in kind of the day-to-day operations and doing research, and kind of some more practical tips to kind of try and tie that abstract kind of policies to how that might actually apply to your data. And I thought kind of it might be useful to kind of try and conceptualize, at least from my perspective, how a data management plan fits into the overall process of conducting and doing your research. So if you kind of view your research as a journey, you know, you're trying to get from A to B. I think of it almost maybe like a road trip where, you know, there's certain sites you might want to see along the way, certain things you want to accomplish. If we're framing it like that, then you can kind of think of your data management and sharing plan as being the vehicle that you're using to get there. So it's going to be kind of, it's not necessarily part of the experience, but it's necessary to get where you want to go with that experience. So if you have a broken down, poorly thought out, poorly maintained data management and sharing plan, that's kind of like setting out on this journey with, a beat up car with flat tires and broken glass and stuff like that. It's going to cause a lot of problems that could potentially then detract from your ability to complete the journey you're on and future journeys. But with kind of some time and effort, and we'll talk about different ways you can do this. If you set up something nice that works, it can really make the whole process a lot smoother. So I'm going to go through some of these elements that we talked about and just try and, it's not going to be a comprehensive or exhaustive list of everything to consider for all of them, but just to kind of spur some thought, give some ideas about what these various elements comprise. So data type, when we're thinking about that, some things to kind of help you think through this might be, setting up or thinking about a sample data file. So when you're in that planning process, if you've done this research before, looking at what type of data it puts out, what are the columns and categories, the types of data that you're going to collect, how big are they going to be, some other considerations for maintaining and running through the data as well as depositing it is what scale are we talking? And, you don't have to know exactly, but, are we talking maybe your whole project is going to generate a couple 100 megabytes of data that need to be stored and maintained? Or is it somewhere in the order of, thousands of terabytes of data that you're going to have storage space for, things like that, time to upload and move it around. Another important consideration here when you're thinking about how you're going to collect and maintain this data is thinking about machine readability. If you use things like R or Python or other programmatic things to analyze your data, you're probably familiar with this. This was actually an area that I had to learn a lot in because I just kind of dumped all my stuff into Excel, made some haphazard transformations into SPSS to run my statistics, and then kind of called it good, which worked for me. And you might be in that situation as well. But the other consideration there is if your data is not machine readable, it's not in some sort of, tab separated or comma separated format. Even if that's okay for you, when you're putting this data out there, part of the idea is that it can be reused and can bring forward future research. So things like meta-analyses, reanalysis of your data, things like that. It's going to make it easier for other people to use your data if you put it in a good machine readable format, which then ultimately is good for the field because we have more sharing of data, more sharing of knowledge. But it can also be good for you personally because that's potentially these data sets can be cited, tracked, things like that. So you can use it as a measure of your research productivity and output. Okay, thinking about related tools, software, or code. So this is another one of the elements. Oops, I am advancing the wrong slide. So data processing. So if your data has to be processed from some sort of raw output, documenting in your data and your process what that was, thinking about, are you providing the raw data or just the processed data? If you're only providing one or the other, making it clear what process was used to get it processed so that way people have it available. If you're using codes or packages, like analyzing genomics or metabolomics or things like that. If you're using pre-written stuff, making sure you document in your data plan and things like that. And you can update it as you go along, but what code you're using, what package versions you're using. If you're writing code as part of your research or writing programmatic things like that, incorporating the use of something like GitHub or some sort of version control tool to be able to track those changes through time, to be able to share that. GitHub is great at both of those things there. So thinking through this process of your data management plan, how are you processing it, having that documented, and then using tools for GitHub if you're writing code, things like that. For the standards one, having standards for your data, one of the most important things here is that, and that will help you as you're kind of in that planning phase, and then helping, because as Megan kind of talked about, the execution and implementation of this plan is also important, is documenting these standards out. So writing through everything down to what's your convention for naming files. Is the stuff that the machine puts out what you're going with? Are you renaming that? Are you doing something like year, month, day, observer, some sort of descriptive title? having that all standardized, but also spelled out so that anybody who's working on the project can come in and can immediately say, okay, I created a new file, how do I name it? And there's a kind of standard for that. Organizing your research folders in a way that, those are not just like project one, data, other stuff, things like that, but building out a cohesive file and folder structure within your projects that make it easy for you, for your team members to go through and know where stuff is, know what's going on, help other researchers out if they are accessing your data after the fact. And it's really a service to yourself to help future you, because future you 6, 8, 10 months from now, 2 years from now, is going to have no clue what current you was doing. And so documenting this out, including READMEs and standards for those READMEs in your data folders, things like that, can go a long ways towards helping just make the flow of this whole process work easier. If there's a README in every folder of your project that describes the process and the standards for what should be done in that project, then everybody can be on the same page for that. And then also consider intersections of these standards. If funders, other funders you might have, if you have multiple funders on a project, publications you might be going with, things like that. If they have standards related to that data, look ahead towards those and incorporate those into your DMSP, so that way you're capturing that as well. Thinking about data preservation, accesses, and associated timelines. So, as part of that data management process, going through and thinking about a project data timeline, when stuff gets deposited, where it gets deposited, retention policies, not only for the data that you're going to ultimately dump in the repository, but other data that you're collecting. It may be that because you don't want to just have data that doesn't need to be kept lying around necessarily. So having a retention policy, having firm deadlines when you're going to delete things. And one thing I found is helpful is to assign a specific person who's responsible for deletion, and then set up calendar invites or something like that to help them do that. I was doing a listening session at the library I used to be at, and we wanted to make sure we weren't keeping recordings of our participants just hanging around forever. So I volunteered to be the deletion person and said on January 7th of whatever year, I go and I delete these files, check in with the team, make sure, and then actually delete them so they're not hanging around. So that keeps that data clean and tidy as well, so you don't just have everything lingering. Making sure that you're aware of what those access expectations are, funding expectations, thinking about those privacy considerations, so making sure stuff is de-identified, and probably including in kind of thinking back to that last one, that plan or that methodology that you have, where you explicitly write all of this out so that everybody on the project knows what it is. And then thinking about curation as well. So there's kind of a step that I wasn't aware of when I was a researcher. You create all the data, but then when you're going to deposit that data and share it, it actually needs to be curated. So kind of like if you've ever worked with a museum or something like that, where you're not just putting the data out there, but you're documenting that data, you're describing it, where it was found, how it was handled, things like that. So that way other people can look at that data and make sense of it. Some repositories will do some level of curation for you, where you kind of send the data to them and they have either an online process or people who work with you to do all of that curation process. Some of them don't, and they expect you to do the curation of your own data. So thinking about that, making sure you have a plan for curation and have a plan in, have a plan planned for your data curation. Thinking about access, distribution, or reuse, detailing this out for the research team. If you're on a big collaborative group, that's having explicit conversations about who has access to the data, how it's being distributed, what kind of licensing or copyright you might be needing to put on this to both, protect the intellectual property if it's there, if that's a concern, reuse of the data, things like that. Some data repositories have requirements leaning more towards open or less towards open on how you actually share that data. So being aware of those and potential conflicts between those, like if you have private industry or something like that involved. And then again, that curated data is going to be easier for others to use. And I like to think of that as not just a service that you're doing for the field. You're doing that to help your field, to help science, but it's also there's a little bit of a selfish motivation there too, because again, citations, downloads, things like that are things that you can track to measure your research output and to show that your research is useful and being used. So those things help the field and they help you. And then finally, oversight of data management and sharing, having this plan written out, and there's what you submit to the funding agency, but then also having this be a written protocol or a established part of your workflow. So thinking of your data management plan maybe more in terms of an MSDS sheet or a lab manual, where part of the training for folks in your lab is when you have a question about what to do with data, here's the document you go to get these. Thinking of kind of nitty-gritty type things about if this is being stored in a box account or something like that, whose account is it, who has the credentials, who has the passwords, what happens if those people leave, is that documented? In the lab I did my dissertation research in, we had a graduate student who left very unexpectedly, and the project they were working on was partly funded by the state wildlife department, and my advisor had to give regular updates on data collected and things like that. And the manner in which that student left, they left a computer in the office and were completely non-responsive to any messages or emails we sent. And my advisor had no access to that data. We were able to solve it because I have a background tinkering in computers, so it involved me physically removing the hard drive out, doing some Googling into security flaws in the Windows operating system, hooking it up to a Linux machine, and trying to scour files off of it that I could then give to my advisor that she could use in making the report she needed. So making sure that you have those plans and have thought about those sorts of logistical things, coming up with good data backup plans. So thinking through what your backup process is, where it's backed up, who backs it up, when you back it up, how frequently, how many versions of that data you keep. One of the things that we've recommended in the past, or that I've recommended in the past, is trying to establish kind of a data culture in your lab. I've known some people who have like a data Friday lunch hour, where everybody from the lab sits down, has lunch together, and goes through all of their data tasks that they're assigned, doing their backups, updating their documentation, deleting things that need to be deleted, things like that. And kind of that can be a way to add some accountability or things like that. Thinking about these sorts of skills when hiring. So I'm going to talk in a minute about kind of what the library has, but when you're hiring researchers to aid on a project or something like that, maybe asking about what experience they have with DMSP, what skills they have that might be useful, that they can bring to your team to help with some of this work. So that was kind of a overview. Like Megan said, the library, we are here to offer some support with this. I have a link here that's kind of a master kind of document on our webpage on our site that has links to a lot of the different things. If we go back to that example of kind of thinking of your research as kind of a journey or a road trip, it's not a perfect analogy, but I kind of like to think with what we're set up to do at the library right now is kind of like we're AAA. We're not necessarily mechanics. We can help you if something goes wrong in the midst of things and there's a crisis, get things back on track, find a fix. We can also help advise you when you're in that planning process, trying to figure out what kind of vehicle you need, if it's in good condition, things like that. We can sit down with you and do workshops on basic data management principles with your lab or your research group. I've done plenty of those. We can help review plans with you to think about, do you need to include this? Have you thought about that? Things like that. But things we kind of can't do is, we can't maintain the car for you necessarily. We're not really set up to build the car, to provide the car. So one thing, I think about with that kind of thing is, you can build and maintain your own car, or, one thing you can do with stuff like this is, think of it more of a rental car, and maybe this data management and running this sort of stuff is something that you're going to write into your grant to have funding to hire someone to do some of this work for you. So that's another way you can kind of approach this is, putting it into your grants, thinking about money to devote time and resources to making sure that the plan is developed properly and is executed properly. So that was kind of meant to be just a kind of high-level overview, talk about what some of these things look like in practice. I think we can I'll let Ana Lucia, if you want the next speaker to go, if we want to do some questions, but that's all that we had for our talk here.
I think next we're going to hear from Christy from CTSC, and then we will open it up for questions.
Good morning. Let me share my screen here. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Thanks. Really great turnout today. And make sure this is working. There we go. So we've been doing quite a lot of work at the Clinical and Translational Science Center as well. And the beginning of this, at least for me, felt like this comment or this comic. And as you have heard from our co-presenter, there's quite a bit of work that's been done. And I know the library's been doing data management planning for quite some time. So we're well set up to serve our community. So for me, the project started with a request from Dr. Won at the Clinical Translational Science Center. We formed a multidisciplinary, it was a work group, but it was more of an advisory group, and it was open to any individual or functional area who was interested in providing input on what was needed to help health researchers as well, to be successful in implementing this policy. And just wanted to say thanks to the School of Medicine, Office of Research, Grants Management, Compliance, the IRB, the UC Davis Library, and the Data Center of Excellence, as well as my colleagues at the Clinical and Translational Science Center for helping put this together. So we identified some opportunities, and we had originally looked for, did kind of a scan of what was already available, and then tried to identify opportunities. And we found that the focus on the NIH policy requirements, and because it was new for researchers, and specifically issues around patient privacy, de-identification, data provisioning services, and operational support for labs and other areas that may need a little extra assistance. So here are our goals of that group, and we've conquered most. Right now, we are on a promotional tour to talk about what we've put together, where resources are. For example, we've started new office hours from 9 to 11. Anybody can join for any questions related to the NIH data management, data sharing policy. If you want somebody to look at your plan, we can do that as well. And these are new office hours, so we're really flexible, and also have offers to have subject matter experts. Maybe Beth would like to join us on one of those. This was a fantastic presentation, Beth. I really appreciate having that, and I'm sure our folks, I'd love to link to that on our website. So let's see, let's go next here. So here is the new website, and this is in honor of Dr. Barrett, who was really gracious yesterday to let us know that our URL was incredibly long. So wanted to make sure that it was easy to get to. Unfortunately, we can't change the organization's policies, but there are tools out there. So here's a QR code if you'd like to take a look at that. And I'm going to, let's see. There we go. I'm just going to take you to this website and show it to you and a few of the features. UC Love Data Week was actually, that's one of the links here on our site. And I was part of the planning on that group, and there was definitely an interest in focusing on NIH, but at the detail level, I think the de-identification looks really interesting. But I should tell you that some of those fill up really quickly. So if you want to be part of that, please maybe sign up today. So here's the site. We've had quick links back to the library. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't creating things in a silo and that we were linking out to any resource that was already available. And we tried not to duplicate, but we wanted the site to be informative for those that maybe are new to the topic. So some of the featured resources I wanted to look at, because the number one question or request that we got from our advisory group was templates. We would love to see some templates and some samples. And so we definitely created a section in here. There was a whole new batch that came out this week, so we'll make sure to link to those. I selected a few that they had highlighted, but I think Megan touched on this. It's really important. This is not a copy paste effort. It is really looking at this from a perspective of what do I need to include and how could I say something similar about my research. So here are the templates and samples. As I update this at least once a week, this is going to be a living, breathing website. So we'll update it every week to see if we get new information, or I'll link to these presentations, things like that. So it's kind of one-stop shopping, hopefully for researchers. Let's see here, the data management plan tool. This has already been talked about, but I really want to emphasize this tool right here. So it's a free open source online application that helps researchers create data management plans. The tool provides a click-through wizard for creating a DMP that complies either with funder requirements. You know, it's not just the NIH, so there are other useful features. It has direct links to funder websites, help text for answering questions, and it really has some excellent best practice resources. And if you're going to want me to look at your plan, that's one of the things that we're going to ask. We're going to ask that you start it or draft it in the data management plan tool and then share it so that we could work on it together to provide support. This, you know, I think the word future you is probably the number one reason you want to do this, because the having the access to all the stages of your plan. So let's say you update, it'll allow you to show the different versions of your plan. If something changes, or you need to resubmit, or you need to have somebody look at it, this is a really great tool. So I highly recommend, and we would like to see CTSC's recommending that we use that. So the de-identification resource, this is actually really a lot of thanks to the Data Center of Excellence and Jody Nygaard's team for putting this together. This is a great, you know, it's got a few pages on here about some best practices around de-identification. I get a lot of questions about this and what does that mean, and redacted and anonymized. So when you're talking about patient data, the term data de-identification is federally defined. So it's not something where you can just remove a name and say it's de-identified. There's very specific rules around it. It can be complicated. And this guy did a really nice job of kind of breaking it down and being very practical. So let's see if I can get back to my presentation. There we go. Oops, I lost it. Hang on a second. I think I clicked on a link. There we go. So some future topics that we're working on, and these are coming in. I really appreciated the questions that were shared at the beginning. So we have lots of opportunity to do deeper dives on topics, and we're right now really flexible and scalable to what's needed. And I think we'll all find out what that is as the date comes closer. So we've got a good framework for you, but absolutely will be flexible and updating these resources. So we're looking at doing a sample data management plan or template language for folks that use UC Davis Health's REDCap tool. So this was brought up a little bit earlier about controlled access. So obviously in human subjects research, we have that, and looking to come up with the some template language as well as process information, timing, things like that. The number one thing I've got is a tip sheet on allowable costs and samples, decision trees and process flows throughout the research data lifecycle. So folks like kind of this persona based, like, okay, I'm in the planning stages. I just want to deal with this stage. What do I need to look at? Consent language. The IRB is working on consent language because one of the aspects of this is, is this plan consistent with the consent language? So we're coming up with some general information, and I will be linking to that when that's complete. The UC Davis Library has some excellent resources on how to select a repository. So those are available. We'll be linking to those and also looking to do more education. I've gotten a few questions about that. And then there's a big deal about timing when you're curating data from the EMR or requesting data from the EMR. There is a huge process that one must go through in addition to the IRB, just on the operational side. So really trying to, they have a lot of policies and procedures, but we want to add a layer of transparency about timing as it relates to the NIH data management data sharing policy. So then there's some post-award opportunities that we have. So updates, how do we monitor plans? Also was mentioned previously is controlled access with the sharing. So in addition to REDCap or other repositories, maybe UC Davis Health secure repositories, how might we handle a request for access? All right, that's it for me. We hope you take a look at our website. Let us know if there's things we can do better or additional topics. That's it.
Thank you to all our speakers. All right, now we enter into the interactive part of the session. We received quite a few questions from you as you registered for the session. I think most of the questions were answered by our speakers, but I kind of bundled them into three things, and maybe we can quickly revisit them. A question that came up a lot is, do I need to worry about this based on the type of grant that I'm looking at? So I believe Megan shared a link in the chat where there is a resource there where you can identify if you need to comply with this. But for sake of everyone being on the same page, Megan, maybe we can touch base on who doesn't need to worry about this, because I know there's a very defined list of like who does this not apply to, right?
So I went, because the list is pretty comprehensive, but I went through even trying to look at this, like the activity codes from fiscal year 2022. And I couldn't find all of them, but the majority, I would say like 90% of them did look like it would be required. Training grants and fellow, like the T grants and the F grants are usually the ones that there are not requirements for, but it's important to double check. But really the funding announcement is going to be the place where it'll be specified. So hopefully after January 25th, when you're submitting, you should see whether it's required or not.
And then on this, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I know. Does that help?
Yes, I think so. And then the other question that we got a lot is people who have an ongoing award, their data management and sharing requirements are not going to change on the 25th.
They will not. If they go up for renewal, then they will need to submit a plan.
Okay.
This is
the grant type. Sorry.
By the way, this is also in relation to the OSTP memo, a question that I get sometimes. the OSTP memo doesn't say if ongoing grants or active grants will be covered later on, but it's not very likely. So it's probably applies only to new grants.
Okay. Another question we got a lot was regarding availability for long-term archiving of data, and if there are resources available at UC Davis for use and at UC Davis Health for researchers. And in absence of a resource or database or repository existing on campus, are there any recommendations that are being made to researchers as to what services they should be using?
I guess I'm trying to understand if that question is related to just long-term preservation of like storage of data for internal use or submission to a repository for, you know, the next 10 years where it can be. So I think there's some like caveats that maybe we could try and tease out. Dryad is a great repository to consider where data can be, that's available to everyone here, that data can be submitted. However, if it contains health information, it can't go there. Any kind of health stuff should really go into a controlled access repository or dealing with human subjects. In my personal opinion, I would be like pretty careful about where that is put, even if it's de-identified. So we do not have a controlled access storage, like repository for researchers' data that include for human subjects, but there are resources out there. ICSTPR is great for like social sciences. Vivly is a really great option for, and great, Christy's putting some options in chat. For storage, and that was created by some researcher at UCSF and at their CTSC. So there are options out there, and we'd be happy to kind of help figure out what the best repository is. And then if there are additional needs just for like general storage, that's a different question. I will say, this is sort of a sidebar, but this plan, the new policy does allow for budgeting for some of the requirements. So if storage is going to be, or a repository that best meets the need, there's going to be a cost associated with it, then it's a good idea to put that in as part of the budget request for the full length of time that it needs to be stored. So even if you're, if you're going to store it or it needs to be in a repository for 10 years, figure out what that cost would be and then put that whole cost. And it also has to be spent, that whole cost would have to be spent within the time before the grant runs out, if that makes sense.
I can respond on the health system side as far as a data as a repository. So if we're dealing with health data, anytime, we have, and it's research, you'll go through the IRB and you'll interact with the Data Center of Excellence and their tools and resources. So they automatically move the data into REDCap. So that's the repository of preference, although there are others certainly where data is stored, but that gets managed and the researcher is guided through that process by the Data Center of Excellence as part of your data request. So that was, we talked about future topics and template language around REDCap. So if you're going to go through to collect EMR data or imaging data, anything like that, you will generally be routed to that team and they will help you through that process. I put a link into the chat about REDCap and the Data Center of Excellence. So anything to access, use of EPIC data, patient data, imaging data, that's a great place to start.
Christy, I just wanted to clarify the difference between the repositories that Megan talked about and REDCap. REDCap is only for active in-project use, right? It's not used for sharing with a wider community, if I understand correctly.
No, we often provide access to REDCap for sharing purposes. So it just depends on the devil's always in the details. So it depends on the use case. But yeah, we absolutely have partners that will be, especially on collaborations and things like that, where even if they're outside of UC Davis, you know, we'll provision access provided certain requirements are met.
Thank you. Another question that came up a lot was the access to templates, examples, boilerplate language. And I think we saw a lot of resources available from CTSC and from the library. And I think at this point, I would also like to invite our colleague Cheryl, who's the director of the Interdisciplinary Research Support Team at Office of Research, to just quickly give us an overview of what's available from her team, who works a lot with researchers putting together proposals to NIH.
Thank you. Yeah, I just put in the chat that NIH themselves have published some sample plans, and there's a link there. The Interdisciplinary Research Support Team does have a box.com site called our Research Development Toolbox, where we have lots of templates and samples of many different proposal elements, including the data management and sharing plan for NIH that we just put together in the past month. I will put a link to that shortly. I just don't want to do it while I'm talking. While I have the floor, I also just want to mention a few things that I noticed. Some of them have been mentioned, but I just want to highlight them. One thing, that rule about using hyperlinks in NIH grants and the disallowability of using hyperlinks in NIH grants applies to the data management plan as well. So you cannot use hyperlinks in your data management and sharing plan. You can use references and refer back to your references cited document. And we've been mentioning budgeting, including budget items for your data management and sharing plan. And there is a requirement that you have to have a separate subheading in your budget justification that says data management and sharing justification. Even if you don't have any funds for data management and sharing in your budget, you have to still have that heading and just explain why you don't need any funds for data management and sharing. I came across that in my review of information over the past few weeks. That's, I think, everything else that I talked about, that everyone else has already talked about, has covered some of the other things I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. And then the last most popular question we received was regarding consultation for how to put this together, how to deal with the data. And I think Beth did a great job on that. And I just wanted to see if there were if people were aware of any other resources on campus. I don't know if Data Lab has anything available. And just to reiterate that you can reach out to Beth in that link that she provided to schedule a consultation. But is anyone aware of additional resources for researchers who are starting from scratch and are trying to get some good advice in how to set this up for success in the future?
Hi, we're doing office hours every Tuesday from 9 to 11, the Clinical and Translational Science Center. So, you know, at this point, we're not entirely sure of the types of questions, but I would be happy to look at data management plans or start folks off. The website has a link where you can reserve a time slot for that. And one more note on this, I wanted to say, you know, the process of this project, NIH made this very doable. They did a wonderful job on their website. They have a lot of different, you know, what policies apply to me? And you just go through and answer the questions and it'll come up with that. So a lot of these of our site is really linking out to other resources that we found. So NIH did a terrific job. And I encourage folks to, if you're not sure where to start, you know, our web page will link out. You'll see us link out to the NIH page quite a bit.
And I might just chime in here real quick. There's just a little extra way to get in touch with me. So I've done workshops for research groups and lab groups on, you know, thinking about basic data management, and also done consults and stuff like that. You can also, I just put in chat here, set up a consultation with me directly there with this link. And, you know, I can come to your lab meeting. We can hop on a Zoom call or whatever. So I'm happy to sit down and talk through or provide training on a lot of this stuff too. It's stuff that I've done in the past.
Thank you, Beth. So that's pretty much the summary of the questions we received ahead of the session. So if we didn't answer your question, I think this is the time to post it. So feel free to use the raise hand feature, and then I'll call on you and we can look at your question. I think while we wait for people to raise their hand, there was a question in terms of who's responsible for enforcing and monitoring compliance with the DMS plans, and if UC Davis is responsible for that task. I don't know if anyone has any feedback on that.
That's the element 6 that I kind of covered, and so that it's really up to the PI to monitor and make sure that they're staying compliant with the plan that they drafted. That's like draft a plan that you can actually like comply with. I guess it's my biggest takeaway from that. But also the NIH will be, that's sort of a TBD, to be determined kind of aspect, but they are saying that they will request or be monitoring as best they can, and it could have implications down the road if there are issues.
Thank you, Megan. Jason Adams was asking regarding who's responsible for determining if a data set was appropriately de-identified, and I think we can direct him to Christy, right? We discussed a little bit of those resources available for data de-identification.
Yes, that's a great question. And this is one we get quite a bit. So I don't know if you've seen it, Dr. Adams, but Jody did that wonderful de-identification guideline. So my approach, especially if it's health information, is to have, what we call an honest broker. And that usually happens in your data center of excellence. So that's my recommendation, is to contact those folks to make sure that if it's patient data, if it starts out with patient data, and I won't talk about other classifications of data, although there are many protected classes of data, that it go through the data center of excellence or an honest broker, a designated honest broker. So it's not the individual de-identifying, that it's, or at least it's checked out by somebody other than the individual who did it.
Thanks, Chrissy. Yeah, I think this is going to be a really important set of workflows to develop, because I think that leaving it up to individual investigators, especially, in some cases, trainees that may be participating, exposes the institution to a substantial risk of accidental disclosure, and also potentially offers the opportunity for re-identification inadvertently, depending on the nature of the data. And so, I put some stuff in the link as well, or in the chat, in terms of a link to services where you can request consultation from the data center of excellence. And I've been having some offline conversations during this with Dr. Colcutt as well, which I think we can circle back with Dr. Barrett, yourself, myself, and Dr. Colcutt to figure out what those pathways should look like. But I think for others on the call, it can't be overstated how important it is to get consultative support when you have human subjects research data that need to be de-identified and dropped into a public repository like this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Adams.
So here's a new question from Hong Ji. A few NIH templates include language like the Office of Sponsor Programs at University, in our case at UC Davis, that will be administering the award, has created a data management and sharing plan compliance system. So the question is, will UC Davis SPO be working on a compliance management system, administrative system, or oversight system? I don't know if we have any colleagues from SPO on the line that could speak to that.
I'm pretty sure that's a nope.
Yeah, and that's why I did include the specific examples for element 6 that define the PI as being responsible. There's been quite a bit of sort of outcomes havoc rates by some of these examples because they were copied and pasted into applications, and it's not something that UC Davis has. And so I'd recommend, like, if you see that, just put it out of your mind. You know, look
So
at
nice of
something that-
NIH to volunteer our sponsor programs office for doing that, though.
Yeah. Very nice of them.
They're not here, so we could volunteer them. Okay, thank you. So I'm just waiting for more questions to come in. I don't know if I think maybe we answered everyone's questions, in which case, fabulous work, everyone.
Just one additional add to that is there were discussions in our advisory group, kind of work group, that certain functional areas may need some tips and templates and validation so that when they are reviewing prior to submission, that they have what they need to make sure that, I think part of our challenge right now is, a good plan. So what does NIH think is a good plan? And it would be really great to get some of those that are approved and that we could say, this was a good plan, or they liked this, and so follow this kind of format and help us create additional, at the operations level, maybe support for them to feel comfortable. And I think the IRB weighed in at a call yesterday about, I think they'll be looking to see if your data management plan is consistent, or rather inconsistent, with what you've said in the IRB submission. So there's different layers of review, but they are on a different levels. So we're still working through those details. If I find out anything more, I'm happy to share it or put it on the website.
Thank you, Christy. And thank you, Stephen, for reminding me. There was a question regarding core facilities responsibility around the data sharing policy, but correct me if I'm wrong, we've mentioned a couple of times the responsibility falls within the PI. And in this case, I'm assuming core facilities would be more like a service provider, or do they have certain responsibility as the data generator?
Well, it's a little bit tricky. It depends on how they're funded, and there's guidance coming out for centers that are funded, because centers are required to have, if it's at like the CTSC, the primate center, they will need to have data management and sharing plans, or beyond the policy and have to have plans. How that's implemented is still, I don't think that's entirely clear at this point.
I wonder if that's a concern about the PIs writing in course as essentially designated data managers, and that is not something that should happen. It might help core facilities to specify who they expect to be essentially responsible once the data leaves their servers.
We have one more question around the timeline for maintaining data, or the deadline for deleting data. Is there an understanding that data repository can be removed after 10 plus years, or is the archiving supposed to be indefinite?
It's not indefinite. You'll just need, I think the minimum is, well, actually now I'm getting some of the local records management practices mixed up. So I believe it's at least 3. Tesla, do you remember?
It's 3 for the NIH, 3 after the closure of the grant.
Yeah.
But in terms of repositories such as the sharing repositories like Dryad, the data are essentially supposed to live there with their identifier, their DOI, unless there are some changes to the service model in the future. So it's not something that you should expect to go in and delete in 3 years once it's in a general list subject repository.
And one more question, with all these new requirements and additional materials, are we expecting extended review times? Or what have people heard?
I guess review times where? I mean, I think there's additional effort to help get those plans in place. I'm not sure about the.
I think Daniel is referring probably to like the review of the proposal itself and getting a reply back from the sponsor.
Yeah, okay. I don't know the answer to that question. I think we'll know pretty quickly here, but certainly timelines are very important to everybody along the whole process chain. So, I just can't answer that at this point in time about if there is going to be additional. I mean, I figure if it's a good plan and folks have an easy tool to go through and validate that, it meets the submission requirements, then it shouldn't take too long, but we don't know what we don't know about the review process.
Yeah, I suspect it might be like the way human subjects and vertebrate animals are reviewed, that reviewers express concerns, and then that might be like discussed during the just-in-time period that your program officer might ask you to make changes if there are concerns.
And one other note, the plan itself is kind of a living document. So if things change in a year later, it's okay to go back to the program officer and say, hey, we need to make some revisions. So that's totally possible.
Any more questions for our panel or comment? I don't see anything. So I think we're going to close our session for today. I want to thank our panelists because they did a wonderful job of breaking down this new requirement for all of us and pointing us to all of the available resources. We're going to bundle up all the presentations and share them with you. We're going to capture some of the questions that came up and try to just summarize them into categories so that we can properly point you to resources. Next week, we have another research forum. We're going to have our colleagues from Federal Relations come up and talk to us a little bit about the research funding landscape. So I hope to see you all there next week to learn about upcoming funding opportunities from a variety of sponsors. And with that, I just want to give a hand to our panelists and thank them again. Have a wonderful long weekend, and we will see you next Friday. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.